This is Krystal, and thank you for joining me for this week's First Chapter Friday. Today, I will be continuing with our Jennifer Chiaverini series. I have just discovered I've been mispronouncing her last name, so that is not Chiaverini, it is Chiaverini. So this week, we will be reading from the beginning of The Spymistress. Chapter 1, April 1861. The Van Loo mansion in Richmond's fashionable Churchill neighborhood had not hosted a wedding gala in many a year, and if the bride-to-be did not emerge from her attic bedroom soon, Lizzie feared it might not that day either. Turning away from the staircase, Lizzie resisted the urge to check her engraved pocket watch for the 5th time in as many minutes, and instead stepped outside onto the side patio, abandoning the mansion to her family, servants, and apparently bashful bridal party ensconced in the servants' quarters. Surely Mary Jane wasn't having second thoughts. She adored Wilson Bowser, and just that morning she had declared him the most excellent man of her acquaintance. A young woman in love would not leave such a man standing at the altar. Perhaps Mary Jane was merely nervous, or a button had come off her gown, or flowers were not quite perfect. As hostess, Lizzie ought to go and see, but a strange reluctance held her back. Earlier that morning, when Mary Jane's friends had arrived, young women of color like Mary Jane herself, some enslaved, some free, Lizzie had felt awkward and unwanted among them. A sensation unfamiliar and particularly unsettling to experience in her own home. None of the girls had spoken impudently to her, but after greeting her politely, they had encircled Mary Jane and led her off to her attic bedroom, turning their backs upon Lizzie as if they had quite forgotten she was there. And so she was left to wait, alone and increasingly curious. Grasping the smooth, whitewashed railing, Lizzie gazed out upon the sun-splashed gardens, where the alluring fragrance of magnolia drifted on the balmy air above the neatly pruned hedgerows. Across the street, a shaft of sunlight bathed the steeple of St. John's Church in a rosy glow, like a benediction from heaven, blessing the bride and groom, blessing the vows they would soon take. It was a perfect spring day in Richmond, the sort of April morning that inspired bad poetry and impulsive declarations of affection best kept to oneself. Lizzie could almost forget that not far away, in the heart of the city, a furious debate was raging, a searing prelude to the vote that would determine whether her beloved Virginia would follow the southern cotton states out of the fragmenting nation. Despite the clamor and frenzy that had surged in Richmond in the weeks leading up to the secession convention, Lizzie staunchly believed that reason, pragmatism, and loyalty would triumph in the end. Unionists delegates outnumbered secessionist fire-eaters 2-1, and Virginians were too proud of their heritage as the birthplace of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison to leave the nation their honored forebears had founded. Still, she had to admit that John Lewis's increasing pessimism troubled her. Mr. Lewis, a longtime family friend serving as a delegate from Rockingham County, had been the Van Loo's guest throughout the convention, and his ominous reports of shouting matches, erupting in closed sessions, made her uneasy. So too did the gathering of a splinter group of adamant secessionists only a block and a half away from the Capitol. Although outwardly she made light of the so-called spontaneous People's Convention, how can a convention be both spontaneous and arranged well in advance, with time for the sending and accepting of invitations? She had mocked. But the tentative, worried smiles her mother and brother had given her in reply were but a small reward. Although Lizzie managed such shows of levity from time to time, she could not ignore the disquieting signs that the people of Richmond were declaring themselves for the Confederacy in even greater numbers. Less than a week before, when word reached the city of the Union garrison surrender at Fort Sumter in Charleston, neighbors and strangers alike had thronged into the streets, shouting and crying and flinging their hats into the air. Impromptu parades had formed and bands had played spirited renditions of Dixie and the Marseillaise. Down by the riverside at the Tredegar Iron Works, thousands had cheered as a newly cast cannon fired off a thunderous salute to the victors. Lizzie had been dismayed to see, waving here and there above the heads of the crowd, home-sewn flags boasting the South Carolina palmetto, or the 3 stripes and 7 stars of the Confederacy. But when the crowd marched to the governor's mansion, instead of giving them the speech they demanded, John Letcher urged them to all go home. Lizzie had been heartened by the governor's refusal to cower before the mob, and she prayed that his example would help other wavering Unionists find their courage and remember their duty. And if you would like to know what happens next, you can check this title out on the Libby app. Please join me here next week as I read from The Quilter's Apprentice by Jennifer Chiaverini. Thank you and have a great week.